I always hate to interrupt good conversation. But I'd like to welcome you here to Chestnut Hill College tonight and to this presentation by Brother Mickey McGrath. My name is Sister Kathy Nerney, and I direct our Institute for Forgiveness and Reconciliation here at Chestnut Hill College. And so in the name of our institute, I am more than delighted that you are sharing this Easter evening with us. As you know, this is the Wednesday of Easter week, and we gather to celebrate the great new life that has been won for us in the mystery of Christ died and risen. And every Wednesday after Easter here at Chestnut Hill College, we celebrate our annual Forgiveness Day. And this is the 10th anniversary of our Institute for Forgiveness and Reconciliation. And so in the name of the Institute, I want to thank, first of all, the administration, faculty, staff, students, and all of you who have been loyal supporters who have worked with us over these past 10 years to try to create a world where forgiveness overcomes the enmity and divisions, the broken relationships find ways to healing, and the terrible wrongs that people suffer are able to be healed as we pledge to walk together a path to forgiveness and reconciliation. So our theme for Forgiveness Day this year is one of shedding a little light on our world so that we might see the connections that help to make us one rather than the darkness of division that threatens at times to overpower us. But we believe in the mystery of this great resurrection that we celebrate, that the darkness can never extinguish the light. And so with that wonderful theme of light, it seems more than appropriate that we culminate this Forgiveness Day by asking Brother Mickey McGrath to shed some light on our times as he shares with us today his wonderful gifts. So as many of you already know, Brother Mickey McGrath, an oblate of St. Francis de Sales, is an award-winning artist, an author, a retreat director, and a great storyteller. And he's a popular presenter and a frequent keynote speaker at all kinds of conferences, at parishes, at national gatherings, really throughout our country and Canada. So it's really a privilege that he has come here to be with us tonight. You know, Brother Mickey started to draw when he was 4 years old. Isn't that amazing? They say that he used to sit underneath his mother's ironing board and draw. And so what Mickey was sharing with us earlier is that some of his young friends were out playing basketball, and they've reached a time in their life when they no longer can run up and down the court as quickly as they could. But Mickey can still draw. And so you see the value that we have when we have this lasting kind of attraction. And so Brother Mickey today draws, paints probably 8 hours a day on many, many days. Is that true, Mickey? Wow. And he has a studio at Sacred Heart Church in South Camden. He lives there in South Camden. I think it's at the Cathedral Parish with 2 other priests. And so he is both a local guy and a great friend, not just of our college, but of the Sisters of St. Joseph. We call him one of our favorite nephews, since his aunt, Sister Mary McGrath, was one of our great treasures. So in welcoming Mickey tonight, I could spend so much time telling you all the wonderful things that he has done. written out, but I feel like, oh no. No, he's going to tell you so much more himself. He has won several awards for book covers, for many of the artistic renderings that he has made. He inspires so many as he makes connections between art and faith. And so Illumine Us is something that he does so readily and by everything that he does, whether he's speaking or whether he's interpreting his art, with these beautiful quotes. Everybody familiar with these great quotes that he has out there? So it's just a continuous inspiration. One of the great quotes of Mickey's founder, and all of our Oblate brothers who are here tonight too, St. Francis de Sales, is be who you are and be that perfectly. And I think for several decades now, Mickey, as both an artist and a great man of faith, has really spent his life being who he is. And it is that self that he's becoming that encourages all of us to do the same thing. Become who you are. And so tonight, as Mickey presents a topic that I think is so significant to us in these times that can appear to be dark. So tonight, we're going to hear about heroes of hope in a time of crisis in both our church and our world. So, for the many ways in which Mickey will shed hope in this time for us, we are privileged to have him here with us tonight. So will you join me in a warm welcome to Brother Mickey McGrath.
Thank you very much. I am absolutely delighted to be here. It is a bit of a homecoming coming here to Chestnut Hill, and but sitting here all that time gave me time to take a good look at this picture. Look at the size of that dove. It's like an eagle in proportion to the tomb there. But I love that quote, and people always ask what comes first, and sometimes it's the quote, sometimes I already have a picture on hand, and then I'll see the quote that fits it. And I don't remember what happened in this case, but I knew I wanted the tomb to not just look like any old boring old tomb, so I put a little daisy on the door, and I figured Jesus should have a more interesting and creative tomb, don't you think, than the rest of us. This is my favorite. It's my own quote, but I've been saying it a lot lately. The Holy Spirit does not fly backwards. And all these people I want to cling to the good old days, they weren't really all that good, were they? And so we don't move forward that way, And so much of our world and our country, our politics, as well as the church, it's operating out of fear. Everybody's afraid of change, basically. They don't want anything to upset their securities and self-security. And that's not how the Holy Spirit rolls. If we have faith and confidence in the Spirit, then we move forward together. We're never alone, and that's what we have to remember. So tonight we're looking at prophets and of the new church that's emerging, and that's where I get my hope and joy. The people that are showing us the way to what's waiting for us after this mess is over, this hot mess that we're all living through. They've already been here. And that's who we're going to look at tonight. John the 23rd and Dorothy Day and Thea Bowman, all these great and beautiful figures that are expanding our horizons of what it is to be church, and both for ourselves and as a church. But it kind of started with this group here. For 2 summers, I taught a course, a one-credit graduate spirituality class, 1 year at Chicago at Catholic Theological Union, and then last summer at Boston College. And it was called Wise and Holy Women and a Few Good Men. And it was the 4 women doctors of the church. And that's what this mandala illustrates. And I did this actually back in 2011 when all that crazy carrying on was investigating sisters. I couldn't figure that one out. Who could, right? But so I thought I did this, and it's called, you may see the out the border around the outside says, a heavenly leadership conference of women religious. And that's when I really got it. I've always admired all four of those people, but I really started exploring their lives even more, and that's how it evolved into a whole course. And but each of them in their own way spoke truth to power, and in times of great need of reform in their day. Hildegard of Bingen wrote letters to the Pope, and one of them she called him a juvenile fool for putting up with clericalism and priests abusing their power and authority. She didn't want any parts of it. She suffered through 4 popes, one worse than the next. Well, that's not true. One of them was pretty good. And then Teresa of Avila, of course, called into the Spanish Inquisition because she dared to write about mental prayer. The boys up in the top office there didn't want people praying on their own. They wanted to be have the rule of thumb there over them. Catherine of Siena got on her horse and went to Siena and to France and told the Pope, "You get back to Rome where you belong." And she called him my sweet baboo, which was dialect for daddy, my sweet daddy. You go to Rome. You're not supposed to be up here in France. And he listened to her. 6 months later, he moved right on back to Rome. And Therese was much humbler or homier. I mean, she was in the monastery. She never left it once she entered. But she used to love the job when she was sacristan, because even in their own monastery chapel, the women were not allowed beyond the altar rail. They weren't allowed to read scripture on their own. Therese was self-taught in scripture. You know, they were supposed to have a priest there to interpret it for them. But when she was the sacristan, she loved it because she'd go up to the tabernacle door and knock on it and say, "You in there today? How's it going in there?" And so each of these 4 women, what they're all about and what we need again so desperately in the church today, I think, is how to have a personal relationship with God, the Trinity. You know, all 3 of them. And our wonderful former bishop in Camden, Bishop Joe Galante, used to say, you know, we created this whole problem in the first place that we're facing today in the church. He said, because back in the day, we always made sure everybody knew their catechism answers and what was right and wrong and the rules and the regulations, but we never taught people how to have a personal relationship with Jesus. And that's what people are so hungering for, and they're not finding it. And so it's not just a Catholic thing, and many religions just haven't done a great job of showing people how to have that personal heart-to-heart conversation. But all the people we're looking at tonight sure did. So I couldn't be here and not sneak in a few family, why I feel so at home. This is my Aunt Ida, who died 2 years before I was born. I never met her, but I'm named for her. Her name was Sister Mary Lewis, and so my middle name is Lewis, Michael Lewis. And I always felt like I knew her, and I hear so many wonderful things about her from the sisters who were her party, and every one of them, I think, has said she'd be the provincial at some point. She was so widely loved by everybody, great sense of humor, and I understand she liked her beer, which of course is very appealing. And but I remember one time in a time of angst, I used to have a lot of them back in the day. I lived in Mount Airy for 1 year, and I went over to the cemetery to look for her, just to check in and say hello and help or whatever else I was saying. And I glanced, I was standing there, and I looked next door to her, and the next grave over was Sister Jane de Chantal. Of course, that's Francis de Sales' best friend. So I just thought there's some connection here, some soulful connection that I firmly believe, you know. And there's Aunt Mary, good old Aunt Mary, who died on Holy Saturday 3 years ago. So Holy Week's become a very special week for me these days. But Aunt Mary especially, since I didn't know Aunt Ida, but taught me what it is to look for the good parts of religion, the healthy parts, and to not give too much power over to those who are not worthy of us. You know, that's kind of how I've come to look at so much of the leadership. You know, it's just, let them do what they want. I've been telling people, and I said it publicly in a parish in West Virginia the other week for the first time, now is not the time to leave the church. Stay and be annoying. Well, the pastor loved it. He said, "Oh, that's our new parish motto now. That's what we're going to put that on our parish bulletin now every week." And then he introduced me to the next crowd and said, "I think he should be our next." They're having their bishop troubles down there in West Virginia. He said, "I think Brother Mickey should be our next bishop. He'd do a lot better." And I got up and I said, "Well, I couldn't do any worse." I don't know about the better part. But anyhow, all that is from Aunt Mary, who taught me have humor in the midst of it all, you know. Otherwise, you cave in. Therese, if every flower wanted to be a rose, spring would lose its loveliness. And that's right. So a lot of the saints, and you quoted our dear St. Francis de Sales, who we Oblates have adopted as our community slogan or whatever, be who you are and be that perfectly well. You know, that's, as we get older, that's what it's all about, isn't it? The second half of life, when all the stuff that consumes you in the first half, who cares? What you see is what you get. And as I always say, it's okay if you don't like me, because there's a good chance I don't like you either. So, and that's the truth, you know. You reach a point, you don't need anybody's approval or affection. It's like, just be yourself. It's fine. Be the person God put you on earth here to be. And that's such a freeing place to be. I used to walk into a crowd, when I was starting out doing this, and until I was in my 40s, I'd walk into the room and say, oh, I wonder if these people are going to like me. And then I realized somewhere in my 40s I was saying, I wonder if I'm going to like these people. And it's a lot better on this side. I'm not going back to that. Catherine of Siena said, if you are what you are meant to be, you'll set the world on fire. She was a feisty little thing, and she used to boss Scott. Well, she's bossy in general, but she even tried to boss Scott around, and somebody said something to her about it once, and she said, well, I believe that God put the desire for what I'm asking in me in the first place, so he's just expecting me to demand it, because that's what he wants. And there we are. Be who you are and be that perfectly well. I love having my Oblate confreres here tonight, by the way, seeing that quote. Well, I don't know if you know this story, wonderful story. I lead art and faith tours every September. And 2 years ago, we started in southern France. And we went all the way through southern France, but we started in Nice. There's a chapel there that Matisse, my favorite modern master, designed when he was 80 years old for the Dominican nuns. And that was our first day. We visited this very modern chapel that was built 10 years before Vatican II, but he was prophesied. He had to have a special permission for the altar to face the congregation, and it was the artist as prophet experience. Then we spent 3 days in the middle of southern France, stayed in Saint-Rémy and visited the asylum where Van Gogh painted Starry Night, and saw the very barred cells of his room where he painted that. And then we ended in Montserrat and the Black Madonna. So it was an awesome trip. But in that central part of southern France, I don't know if you ever heard the story, I didn't put the other picture in, but and the old legends say that after the Ascension, Mary Magdalene, Martha, Lazarus, and another guy named Maximine got in a boat to follow Jesus' instructions to go out and tell the world the good news. And so while they were out there, the rudder broke and the sail fell down, and they were praying to the Holy Spirit, wherever this boat lands is where you want us to be. And it landed on the southern shore of Gaul, now France. And there's, to this day, next to Cannes, where the big film festival is, a town called the Town of the Maries, where the boat landed. And Mary Magdalene went her way and preached the gospel, and she is credited with being the person who brought the gospel to Gaul and Christianized it. And for that reason, she's the patron saint of preachers. Ain't that ironic? In a church where women can't preach. But it's the same church that has a man as the patron saint of childbirth, so. We have a history of not getting things right, I think. But in any event, Lazarus, according to the legend, he became the first bishop of Marseille, and Martha, who we see here, went her way to preach the gospel. And she came across a notorious dragon named Therese. And he was infamous in Gallic mythology. And we've all seen pictures of St. Michael standing on the serpent with a spear, right? Or St. George stabbing the dragon with his sword. Well, that's the manly way of doing things. Martha's showing us the gentler, feminine way, more Salesian way, if you will, of handling those dragons. And she preached the gospel to it and told the dragon about her brother Lazarus being raised from the dead by Jesus. And it gentled the dragon down. And it went back into town, and the people didn't realize it had been killed. It had been tamed, and they killed it. And in their remorse, they named the town Tarascon, Tarascon. And every year on her feast day in July, they have big parades and processions and floats with dragons on them, and they really do up the dragon. And there's a big Romanesque basilica there with according to pious legend, the remains of St. Martha. And it's next to the town where St. Mary Magdalene spent her last 7 years of life. She lived in a cave, according to that legend. And we climbed the mountain and went in that cave and had mass. And supposedly, the beautiful part of the story, the local bishop climbed and gave her communion the night before she died. And that's how Mary Magdalene spent her last years. And so and this is back, by the way, when they thought Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were the same person. So they thought Magdalene and Martha were sisters. But in any event, it shows that how we all come in, the active and the contemplative part of us, that Mary Magdalene spent her last years in contemplative peace in that cave, and many saints since then have gone into caves for rejuvenation. So there she is, and John 11 is where she tells Jesus, "You're the Messiah. I know who you are." Remember, she's the first one in Scripture to recognize who Christ was. Yet she didn't get ordained, did she? Good old Peter, who denies him 3 times. Hey, get out the oils and that doesn't make sense, does it? Well, one of the women on our trip was named Martha, so I told everybody we have to fuss over her all day. This is her day, and we kind of said special prayers over her. Well, Martha lives in Denver, and she emailed me when we got home, and she said, "Can I have permission?" She said, "I want to have a tattoo made of St. Martha." She wanted the whole picture there on the right. But then she wrote, and I said, "Oh, sure, that sounds neat. I never had that done before." And she wrote back, and she said, "My tattoo artist couldn't figure out how to do the whole picture, so I just had the dragon as a wrist tattoo now." So I just love it, because I think if this whole thing doesn't work out, there's a new career line waiting for me. This is one of my favorite quotes that I think characterizes the modern church today, from Brian Doyle, who died last year. He was 62 years old, a great Catholic essayist and the editor of Portland Magazine. And he said, "There are 2 Catholic churches, one a noun, the other a verb, one a corporation, and the other a wild idea held in the hearts of millions of people who were utterly disinterested in authority and power and rules and regulations, and very interested indeed in finding ways to walk through the bruises of life with grace and humility." Isn't that beautiful? There's so much to meditate on in there, but I think that's where we are in this, red and blue and progressive and not and all that. So last year, Pope Francis in Lent said, "If we listen attentively, everything around us groans. Creation itself groans. We human beings groan. The Holy Spirit groans in our hearts. The Holy Spirit keeps alive the hopes of our hearts. These groans are not sterile, but speak of the pangs of birth, the ushering in of new life." And I love that, because it speaks to what I'm choosing to, all this groaning that we're hearing in the church. If you think of it as birth pangs, changes the whole playing field, doesn't it? And it's like there's something new, like that creative tomb with the flowers painted on it. That's what's waiting for us. So I said, burn it down, let's start over again. Let's get this thing moving along and get going. And I think all the people that we're looking at tonight, the prophets coming up, are the people leading us into this next church reality. I love in the last Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, Erasmus, the great Catholic philosopher, loved Luther and was very, very tempted to follow him. He believed a lot of what he said, but ultimately decided to stay in the Catholic Church. But he said, "I put up with this church until I see a better one, and she's forced to put up with me until I myself become better." And I thought, there's my slogan for life now. It's like, what you see is what you get. If you don't like it, too bad, right? I still have my good friendship with Christ, and nothing gets in the way of that. And at the closing of the symposium last month at the Vatican on how to handle the priest abuse, the sex abuse crisis, the closing remarks were made by this Nigerian nun, Sister Veronica. Tilt this on an angle. Who said, "We must acknowledge that our mediocrity, hypocrisy, and complacency have brought us to this disgraceful and scandalous place. We find ourselves as a church, in this place we find ourselves as a church. We pause to pray, Lord, have mercy on us." And if you read her speech, it was awesome. She really called them out. She was Catherine of Siena, Hildegard, telling those boys, clericalism. the sex abuse is only a symptom of the problem. It's not, we have to get at the systemic root of the problem, which is clerical authority and domination. So last week I was in Minneapolis. I spent Holy Week in Minneapolis, as you'll see, but that last Monday afternoon I was riveted to, I was staying in a home that didn't have a TV of all times, so I've heard the news about Notre Dame, but I watched the news feed on my iPad, and I fished out, this is a drawing. Last September's trip was to Annecy, where St. Francis de Sales was from, in the French Alps, and then Paris. And I spent a whole day sketching outside Notre Dame. So I posted that, and what I'm going to do is hopefully is make prints of it to raise money. And I'm thinking maybe not for the churches in the Notre Dame church, there's enough billionaires putting in money for that, but the 3 churches we were talking about at dinner in the South that were burned down, and racial injustice there. And so these fires were just so, as an artist and somebody who leads tours to look at these things, and Gothic cathedrals of all kinds are just very, very special to me. So it was heartbreaking to watch this. And so I did this church. It's Notre Dame with the flames, and after I did it, I thought it needs words of some kind. And then I read Ilia Delio's response to it, in which she said it reminded her of the quote of Jesus to Francis of Assisi, who said, "Repair my church, which has fallen into ruins." And Francis took him literally and started rebuilding by hand churches around Assisi. And I think maybe that's a reminder, the church, Mother Church is in need of rebuilding in so many ways. So our first prophets, Mary and Elizabeth. Now, they're not contemporary, but their spirit sure is, the spirit of the visitation. And I've painted dozens of visitation images because, for those of you who might not know, Francis de Sales and his best friend, Jane de Chantal, founded an order of nuns called the Sisters of the Visitation. And they chose that name because they wanted them to be women who would go out on the streets and visit the poor in their homes, visit the sick where they were. But the church said, oh, women shouldn't be doing that social justice stuff. No, that was 2011. Hold on. I always get them mixed up. So so it's an image and it keeps coming back to me in many different ways and cultures. And I just love this quote of the Pope. So I like to describe the feminine dimension of the church as a welcoming womb that regenerates life. So this was the first major one I did when I left teaching and needed work, and I got this commission. The Holy Spirit always provides, and it was for the sisters in Minneapolis, and it's this painting more than any other that has bonded us together. They're called the Nuns in the Hood. They decided 35 years ago they didn't want to live in strict monastic enclosure and work at uppity girls' schools. So they said they wanted to move into the inner city and do what Francis and Jane had in mind in 1610. So there they are, the heart of North Minneapolis, and this painting was commissioned for them. We don't have time for all the stories, but I just want to share because that's what has bonded us together. It's hanging over their fireplace now. And I took this picture last week, and you can see it hanging there. And two of them are two of my favorites. They're all very, very dear to me in one way or another, but my 2 favorites are not well, and that's why I went out there last week. It made me think of Aunt Mary. I thought, I want to spend, what holier week than to spend with people and see them now while they're alive. That's the Salesian way, the present moment, don't worry about tomorrow. So there they are. And here's one, Sister Virginia on the left there, and she's in a Catholic elder care home as she recovers from hip surgery that went awry. Look at that smile. I told her, I said, you're a prophet for me. She is uncomfortable. She's there, she in this home. It's not far from the monastery, but she was smiling the whole time because she's so accepting. This is God's will for me right now. She's doing ministry to staff and all the other people who live there. And this is my other favorite, Mary Marg, who had a stroke 2 years ago. And she's largely bedridden now. This one I took last Thanksgiving. I went out there. But Mary Marg was lying there, and she said, I have a lot of time to lie here. And she said, I decided I don't want to leave this world with white privilege hanging over me. So she has started a 12-step recovery group for white privilege to help people be free of white privilege. And last Sunday, Palm Sunday, when I arrived, the group was meeting in the living room there. And it was just so powerful, so moving to hear from the black parishioners. Their local pastor loved the idea, and he said, was doing it as a Lenten thing for, the parish. And there they were. Mary Marr came down from her room and had handouts that she prepared, linking the Beatitudes with the 12 steps of recovery, and just a whole way to free ourselves of those burdens, you know, to not take advantage of privilege, you know. That's how they've been living in North Minneapolis. When I was there in Thanksgiving, we were sitting there visiting, and these 6 men came up from a local drug rehab center that's just 2 blocks away that the sisters for 30 years have had a very close relationship with. And anyhow, these guys came up. They were there to distribute the 120 turkeys around the neighborhood that the sisters, their local girls' high school visitation academy raises the food and the money, and these guys distribute it. And anyhow, I was sitting there visiting with Mary Marg, and they came up, and they said, "We didn't want to leave, sister, until we came up to say hello." And she just looked up and she said, "Thank you." She said, "For what you've done." She said, "We would never be able to do this without your help." And the guy said, "No, sister." He said, "Thank you, because you've given us back our self-respect and dignity." I start crying right there on the spot. That's the visitation today. You know, if we keep all the beautiful stories of the Mary and Elizabeth back 2,000 years ago, something nice had happened then we're missing the whole point. That's the visitation still. What you're doing here is the visitation still happening today. Old meeting young, and hopeful meeting fearful, and all of that, you know. So one of the very special women I've met through the sisters is this beautiful person. I put her in because it's Forgiveness Day here, and Mary Johnson's her name. And she's, the sisters are very tight with her. Years ago, her 16-year-old son was murdered by another 16-year-old.
We just told her story this afternoon.
Did you really? Oh, wow. Should I not repeat?
No, that is not an accident.
Yeah, that's weird. Anyhow, Mary was going to the boy's trial. Never met him. But on the day of the other kid's sentencing, the other boy's mother starts carrying on in church. "Oh, my baby, you're taking my baby. I'll never see him again." And she said she never felt such hatred and anger in her life. She wanted to go up and slap her and saying, "You'll see your baby, but he's going to be behind bars. But mine was killed by your baby, and I'll never see him again." And she said she couldn't live with herself. And months later, she went to visit the prison and to meet him face to face and forgive him. Because she said, "I was never that kind of person that harbored hatred and revenge and anger, and I couldn't live with myself." She forgave him, and she now calls him her spiritual son. They go around giving talks on the power of forgiveness and how we can't move forward if we're stuck in some old place that we don't, that's just not keeping us mired in the past. And look at that smile. Shortly after this picture was taken several years ago, the sisters called me and they said, "Guess where we're going today?" I said, "Where?" And they said, "Mary Johnson's wedding." She started a group called From Death to Life, and every Saturday at St. Jane Guest House, they meet. It's all parents of murdered children. And she said, from day one, we have to include the parents of murderers because they too have lost their kids in some way. So every Saturday they come for coffee and once a month, coffee and prayer and just support. And she fell in love with one of the fathers coming to the group, and they're now married and living happily ever after. So another way of death coming to life. Whenever we do something together, something good, something beautiful, everyone changes. All of us change in some way, and this does us good. So one of my more recent visitation images was commissioned by Magnificat High School, a girls' high school in Rocky River, Ohio. It's a suburb, very nice suburb of Cleveland. It sits high on the Lake Erie. It's just beautiful. And I had done their faculty retreat the year before and loved it. So I got a call a year later, and they said, "We're interested in commissioning a mural for the entrance of our school. And as a separate commission, we'd like to commission 3 sketches to see, if we're heading in the same direction." And so I said, sure, but I had just hurt my rotator cuff, and I thought I probably shouldn't be doing all that movement. So I said, "I can do it on my iPad, then it's a go." And they said, "Oh, sure, we don't care how you do it." So I did the final product on my iPad, but had it blown up to a 6-foot-tall canvas. But in any event, I sent these out there, and I wasn't hearing from them. And I thought, this is starting to get a little concerning that they weren't saying a word. And finally, I was driving up in Albany, And I was up at a spot where I didn't know there were 3 road signs, and I'm trying to think of which one do I want, and the phone rings. And I normally wouldn't have picked it up, but I saw who was calling, and I thought, oh, I better get this over with, right? And it's the principal. She said, there's 5 of us sitting in my office, and we want to talk to you about the sketches you sent. And I said, okay. I said, well, if you don't hear anything from me, it's because I don't know where I'm going, and I'm trying to read signs, but I said, I'm still with you. And she said, oh, we'll call back. I said, no, because I'm thinking I want to get this, move us along. I said, oh, my gas light just went on, which it had. And they said, and she's stumbling around, and oh, they're lovely sketches, blah, blah. And she said, I'm going to put Sister Helen on. So Sister Helen was the head of mission identity at the school. And I thought, oh, they're bringing out the big guns now. Sister Helen gets on. She said, brother, the sketches are lovely. She said, but that's not what we're looking for. She said, we don't need Elizabeth. Because I'm thinking girls' high school, mentor, we don't need Elizabeth, and we don't need the words of the Magnificat, and all your Marys are just too sweet looking. And she said, we want a Mary that looks like a strong, powerful leader, because that's the kind of women we're training here at Magnificat High School. And I'm like, all right, where's the gas station? And I'll get right on it as soon as I have to get more comfortable. So I went back to work, and here it is. This is the Mary of the Magnificat. A little more cosmic. I sent it up to a guy I have in Albany. He turned it into a 6-foot canvas last Easter, and I drove it out to Cleveland, and we spread it out on the stage of their auditorium, which is like a Broadway-worthy. They have 4 art teachers at this school. It's unbelievable. And I was brought silver and gold paint to dab more stars on there to make it really cosmic, and they started bringing the art classes through. And I started feeling like I was at my own viewing, because they're just walking by like this, looking, and nobody's saying a word, And so finally, the second class, I said, girls, do you want to paint some stars for me? So I gave them, look at them, they lined up to paint stars in there. So it's now become a communal experience. It was awesome. And the next day, we unveiled it at a big school assembly, 900 girls sitting there. I gave a half-hour talk on multicultural images of Jesus and Mary. And then we unveiled the painting. The 3 art students came up, and they pulled the curtain off it on the stage, and there it was. And then we had a 15-minute Q&A. They put microphones and it was just the most beautiful experience. And I shared with them about the 3, and I said the whole point of that story, I didn't take that personally. I know they were good sketches. I didn't, it wasn't about that. It was about teamwork, and how when you haven't found the right thing, don't give up on yourself. Keep going, And I said I'm grateful because Sister Helen and the committee led me to deeper places within. I'm glad I didn't just do another knockoff of Sweet Mary and Elizabeth. I've done a million of them. This was something different and deeper. Well, then I went and visited the art classes and went into the faculty lunchroom and sat down, and I was asking everybody what they taught. And the one young woman, she said, oh, I teach theology. I said, what are you teaching this semester? And she said, oh, it's a course I designed called Vatican III. And she said, and I'm the Pope. And she said the girls have to write essays and questions after doing research about issues that need to come up at Vatican III, especially as they pertain to women. I thought, boy, I am not in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia anymore. I think I have the same pants and shoes on right now. And then last August, I went to a life-changing trip to Kenya. I was 1 week in Nairobi painting murals at an AIDS clinic, and then 1 week with Catholic Relief Services in Western Kenya, and I'll just show you the one little portion of it. But before I went over, I was doing morning sketches of it's my first time to Africa, but I thought, here's the Christ child with a Lion King t-shirt on. And when I got over there, I found out that Jambo is how you say hello in Swahili, the national language of Kenya. And so this is now Jambo Jesus. And there's the visitation. And this is in a clinic for pregnant women with HIV. Because there's a medication that exists now that if they take it faithfully every day, they will not pass it on to the baby. And I thought, what better place to put an image of the visitations? I did it in black and white and my iPad and sent it over, and they printed them out for coloring, so the little kids who are there with their moms for appointments can color it. And the woman on the left is this modern prophet who started the whole thing. Back in 1992, she went to her pastor, who was a Maryknoll priest. I was there working with a Maryknoll priest friend of mine who lives there and works for this foundation. anyhow, she went to her pastor and said, I want to start a parish volunteer program for people to go into the slums and visit people with AIDS, just to be a spiritual comfort. Well, it has grown from that humble little parish program to this organization that she's now the head of, that has 14 satellite offices around East Nairobi and serves 27,000 people. It's just devastating. And the guy on the right is the physician who's the head of the whole thing. Right there at the home office, which is where my friend Rick's office was, there are 120 people on staff working there. And they have testing equipment, everything, the medications. And so that's where we did our first mural, right there in that waiting room for the pregnant mothers. Well, yeah. So I drew in chalk on the wall, and then Samson, a young social worker, started helping. He helped me outline in black, and we created giant paint-by-number murals. And I had said ahead of time, I will need help. Not knowing, I did it based on my calendar. August was the only time I had, that it was winter school break. So all the kids were out of school that week, and so I had the help of 7 teenagers to help me paint these murals, each of whom have HIV, because their mothers didn't have access to this medication when they were born. And so it became this beautiful healing moment. I loved these kids. They were awesome. They dove into this. By Monday, we started Monday morning, and black and white work was done by lunch, and then after lunch, they started coloring, and by the end of the afternoon, they were well on the way to being finished. They were finished the next morning by lunch. And my worry now is, what am I going to do till Friday? I hope I can get one done by Friday, but they were so excited. And I had asked for 2 walls to be prepared, because we did one in the men's clinic, and they thought I meant 2 walls in each room, so there were 4 walls to deal with. So on the spot, I just drew 2 new ones, and we don't have time to look at them. But these were the 7 kids, and they just, as I said, dove into this. It was their time. Rick said, you have no idea what this means, because they're ostracized at school and picked on for being HIV positive. And he said, this is their time. They're painting, they're having fun, they were teasing each other, laughing, not judging each other. And it was just so beautiful to watch. Then they take a break and they listen to their phones, hip hop music. And I remember a couple times I said, oh, do you know this one? He's American. I'm like, no, I'm not up on my hip hop. But they were awesome. And there they are. And one day at lunch, the boy, 15 years old on the lower right there, Rick was getting chips and fried chicken for them every day. And he asked out of the blue, he said, you're always asking us questions. Can I ask you a question? I said, sure, thinking he's going to ask, why do Americans call chips French fries, you know? And he said, what's your meaning of success, your definition of success? And I was like, I did not see that coming. And I finally said, I think it's when you discover your gift, whatever your gift is, and you nurture it and use it. I said, you're going to be successful no matter what you do in life. It's not about how much money you make. And he said, oh, I agree with that, and went back to his chicken and fries. But I thought the depth coming out of these marginalized voices, that's what it was doing for me. And you can, maybe up front, you can see the numbers in the white spaces, but there it was. And so that gave me up. By the end of the first afternoon, I thought, this isn't about me anymore. I did what I was called here to do. I drew it on the wall. It's their project now. And I didn't micromanage, tell them how to hold brushes, By Wednesday, they were there in the morning before I was to paint. And so that freed me up to sketch. And you can see there was a mom sitting there for her appointment, and this little guy, that's him in the lap there, you can see. But he was one of the girl's little brother, 2-year-old brother. His name was Maxwell. And she had to bring him every day. Her mother brought him. Rick told me it could be because that was the only food he was getting all day, was the lunch that we were providing. But in any event, he was adorable, running around. He wasn't a bad kid. He was just 2. He was like, pick me up, pick me up. Anyhow, I'm sitting there sketching one day, and I look up, and all the teens were on the other side of the room watching me. And they said, we'd like to take a picture of you while you're sketching, if that's okay. I said, sure. And then I said, that's my phone. They were using my phone to take this pic. I said, how did you get my phone? They said, oh, Maxwell took it out of your pocket while you were drawing. But look at that. How do you get mad at a little face like that? So that's the Christ child in Nairobi for me. So there's more and more. There's one of the mothers that was there for her appointment. another little girl that was running around. And so we're evolving, and here's the final product. And the word upendo is in there, and it means love in Swahili. And then I had them all sign their names. And then the next day, we put the benches back in, and here's the mothers fresh at it with the new mural on their wall. And even the ones who aren't Christian and don't know who Mary and Elizabeth are know what love is, and pregnancy, and flowers, and hope, you know? And that's what this is all about. It's beauty, you know, even in the most hopeless situations. Always look. I just learned this quote. G.K. Chesterton said it. Your religion is not the church you belong to, but the cosmos you live inside of. And Thomas Merton, we're already one, but we imagine we're not. What we have to recover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we are. Be who you are and be that perfectly well. It just seems to be the wisdom of the mystics across the ages. So here's the 5 prophets of hope and joy that we're going to take a look at now. And one of my favorites, this guy, John the 23rd, who, of course, created Vatican II. When I was a novice in 1976, it was only 10 years from the end of World War II. What was a Vatican II? And I remember our novice director, Bob, is my novice mate. And I don't know if you remember this, but Bill Gallagher said one day in class, it's going to take at least 50 years before all this Vatican II filters down to reality. And here we are 50 years from the end of Vatican II. And I think what a prophet. I didn't appreciate him being a prophet when I was 20 years old, but I think it's so true. What we are dealing with now is the effects of people who still don't like Vatican II or still aren't willing to, and those who are, others who are struggling to say, you know, yeah, it's about laity and women and all the people that have been in the margins. But Pope John's the first person to start using the term the Holy Spirit. Remember, it used to be the Holy Ghost, and nobody knew what to make of that, right? But he said the Holy Spirit's in everybody, and it's time for a new Pentecost. The Pentecost isn't just something that happened 2,000 years ago. It's an ongoing, evolving event. One of his favorite expressions was this: Vox temporis, vox Dei. The voice of the times is the voice of God. He said it's time to shake off the dust of Constantine that has settled on the papal throne. And then what we know of as church today is really more about Constantine, not about Jesus or St. Paul. It's all about bureaucracy and rules and regulations and punishment and judgment and all that stuff. So he came up with Vatican II. And the theme of Vatican II, as he said, is aggiornamento, which is Italian for let's get the show on the road, let's keep moving here, there's no going backwards now. And what they learned, what we now know, is that during World War II, John was responsible for saving, some people estimate as many as 10,000 Jewish lives by forging baptismal certificates for them to get them out of Europe. And so it's a beautiful event. And they said that when he saw the first newsreel footage coming out of the liberation of Auschwitz, the people that were with him said he turned white as a sheet. And he said, we all knew this was happening. You know, these deniers, you know, he said, everybody knew. And he said, but we never had visual proof until now. And he said, what we're looking at in this newsreel is the mystical body of Christ. And it's the first time somebody said a Jew was part of the mystical body of Christ. That the being a part of Christ and creation was what makes us of Christ, not religious affiliation. And so Pope Francis says the same things all the time. It's God's in everybody, even atheists, you know, it's no getting around it. But people still don't want to hear it, like Steve Bannon. Anyhow, so this is Christ in Auschwitz with the star on his uniform and John looking in. And this is the painting I produced the first time I visited the Holocaust Museum, the year it opened, back in 1993, down in Washington. And it's the Madonna of the Holocaust wearing the different tags that the Nazis wore. What Pope John the 23rd knew that somehow got lost in history was that in 1555, Pope Paul IV, who excommunicated Ignatius of Loyola, thought he was too radical, and also, but he created the Jewish ghetto and said all Jews in Rome had to live in the ghetto walls for 300 years. They lived in this filthy, disease-ridden, poverty-stricken slum. It's now one of the trendiest hot spots to live in Rome. All the young hipsters are living there. But in any event, that for 3 centuries, that's what it was. And he said if Jews leave the ghetto and walk the streets of Rome, they have to wear a yellow patch on their clothing. You thought Hitler came up with that. It was a pope. Now, Pope John knew this history. And the night he was elected pope, he asked for the limousine at midnight to come around. And he said, take me to the synagogue of Rome, the largest synagogue in Europe. And the driver revealed this years later and said he prayed in the back seat of the car for 15 minutes and then tapped on the window and said, you can take me home now. And what he was praying for was healing and forgiveness and coming together. And he said the church can no longer be a part of the problems in the world. It has to be part of the solution of the problems and come into the technological age, you know. So he was talking like this 50 years ago. This prayer was found in Ravensbrück concentration camp for women when the Allies liberated it. Oh God, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will, but do not remember only the suffering they've inflicted on us. Remember the fruits we bought thanks to this suffering, our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, and the courage, generosity, and greatness of heart that has grown out of all this. And when they come to judgment, let all the fruits we have borne become their forgiveness. Isn't that a most powerful prayer ever? Whoever wrote that, the saint and the mystic. Did you have that today too? Yeah. So on his deathbed, Pope Francis, he had a lot of opposition, just like Pope Francis does. Everybody loves Pope Francis except some Catholics, right? And we had a guy come up to somebody at the cathedral where I live at a reception, our former rector, and he said, Father, he said, I'm Jewish. He said, but I love our Pope. He called Pope Francis our Pope. But anyhow, on his deathbed, Pope John said, the moment has come to acknowledge the signs of the times, to capture the opportunities and look afar. The gospel isn't changing, the way we hear it is. And that's what he was trying to be in tune with. His chief enemy in all this was a man named Cardinal Ottaviani, who didn't want any parts of that. He was the biggest voice against vernacular language in the liturgy and all that. But he once made the statement, I hope I die before the council's over because I want to die Catholic. And he did. Another great prophetic voice of the time, St. Oscar Romero. Isn't that great to say saint there? And his life is, I love this quote, Pope Francis said, shepherds should smell like their sheep. Now, it took Pope Francis to canonize Oscar because Pope John Paul II didn't like him a little bit because there were other creepy bishops that didn't like Oscar's work with the poor. And one in particular was writing letters to Rome all the time telling John Paul he's a communist and you got to get rid of him and he's ruining the church. And John Paul, coming out of Poland and communism and all that, believed it. So he didn't really have any regard for Oscar Romero. Francis, coming out of Argentina, gets it. Liberation, you know. This is one of Oscar's quotes, the people are my prophet, and with people like this, it's not hard to be a good shepherd. Let's not hide the talent God gave us on the day of our baptism, and let us truly live the beauty and responsibility of being a prophetic people. And every time he acted out and said these things, he knew he was targeted. He knew the day was coming. He was sure of it. He said, the ones who have a voice must speak for those who are voiceless. And so 2 years ago with Catholic Relief Services, I went to Guatemala on a sketching trip. And part of it, we went up into the Quiché, into the mountains in the central part where for 30 years a civil war raged and the government killed, genocide, 50,000 people. And a lot of their soldiers were trained at the School of the Americas in Georgia. You know, so I mean, all this uglier and uglier. So Catholic Relief Services is doing incredible work. We have every reason to be proud of them. When people say, I'm not giving any money to the church, it's like, well, don't give it to CRS because they really do. They're doing amazing stuff. And we went up to these schools. They have them all over Guatemala and to teach the kids Spanish because they said they only speak Mayan or Quiché and they won't get any advancement or any jobs if they don't know Spanish. And so also it's to feed them. They give lunch every day because 70% of the children of Guatemala are malnourished. These are the kids at our border that we're putting in cages, not murderers and rapists and smallpox-ridden whatever. I put that in the wrong spot. Catherine of Siena, cry out with 1,000 tongues, I see the world is rotten because of silence. Anyhow, back to Quiche. So what they set up is they had young people, these are college-age people who are in a program, they're called coffee cuppers. Coffee is the largest export of Guatemala, and they were having a blight, a coffee blight. So I thought, these people can't catch a break. But these kids drove 5 hours to show us what they've learned through CRS about how to deal with coffee beans and how to roast them, when's the time right, and different blends and all. They were so proud. They did a whole little demonstration, and we all got a cup of coffee at the end of it. Then we met these kids who have learned kitchen skills, how to cook and how to run a kitchen management. There's a lovely little thing there that Sister Ginny's the one who runs all this. Sister Ginny is a sister of charity from New York, and she oversees this whole operation. And it's to train college-age young people to give them a skill so that they can work for life. So this crowd was learning cooking, and then they set up a tent, and they were showing us the hairdressing and barbering. And I had lunch with the young woman on the upper right there, who shared with me that she was a graduate of the program. She just came back to show us how to cut hair. And she said, I live in a remote village, and she said I had to leave my house at 4 o'clock in the morning and walk every day for an hour on a dark road to get to the bus, and then ride a bus 2 hours to get to the Barbara Ford Peace Center. Not a word of complaint, not the slightest. She said, I'm so grateful, I have a skill now. She said, I'm back in my village, we're too poor and remote. And she said, I can't open my own shop, but I have clients coming to my home, and she's doing hairdressing, you know? And never a word of complaint, and we're all looking at us, the visitors, like, or, you know, we complain if we don't get the internet fast enough, you know? And this is somebody who walked 3 hours, traveled there every morning. And she said, I also made friends because there aren't as many young people in my village, so she said, I've made lifelong friends here because we're all coming to class together. It was beautiful. And so this is Sister Ginny who runs the whole thing. And she said, I'm 72 years old, and we're worried about when the sisters from New York go. She said, we're training they had Guatemalan novices, but she said they're not equipped yet to take over the administration of this. So she said, that's our thing now. And she also told me, she said, I'm writing grants to get money. She said, we've given all our young people the skills now. She said, I have to get them jobs and places to use the skills we're getting for them. And I looked at her, I said, do you ever get discouraged? She looked at me like I was crazy. She said, discouraged? There's no time for that. She said, if one thing doesn't work, you keep looking and you find another way. She said, that's how it works. And then she turned and she said, and you'll probably want to come back and do some art with my young people. And I was like, yes, sister. You know? And I would love that someday. It hasn't happened yet. Here's a quote of Oscar's that I have one of the children, immigrants, crying in his heart there, the Christ's Sacred Heart. There are many things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. And so I posted this a few months ago on my Facebook page. A lot of you get them, I think, or at least through my website if you're not a Facebook person. And as the caravan was getting closer, I posted this, Jesus at the border, got, I think, almost 100,000 views. And after a while, you stop reading the comments. I don't reply even to the good ones. I just don't want to go there. But two were really only negative. Only two were negative. One used a word that I can't repeat in polite company. Some of you look polite anyhow. But one guy said, obviously you don't read scripture because Jesus only washed the feet of his disciples, you idiot. I thought, I'm the idiot because you didn't get that story, you know. It's like, why would you even try to dialogue with an idiot like that? Oscar Romero, strive not to have more, but to be more. Ah, there she is. We all know enough about Dorothy, but I just love the Pope's speech to the Congress of the United States. Was that not, remember, it was the most awesome, one of his finest speeches ever. And he started off, he said, I want to talk about 4 great Americans that have a lot to teach you. And he started with Abraham Lincoln. You think, oh, that's obvious. And he said Martin Luther King. I thought, oh, this is getting interesting. Then he said Dorothy Day, and it was all over. And by the time he got to Merton, I was in a puddle on the floor there in the living room. And I thought, I can't believe our Pope is talking to the Congress of the United States and all those Catholic politicians that boycotted it. There were a number of them, because they said, I don't want to be lectured to by the Pope about climate change. Well, moron, they didn't even talk about climate change, you know, and they missed this beautiful, beautiful moment. So Dorothy Day, I call her Saint Dorothy Day. but one of her, she's servant of God, Dorothy Day. One of her famous lines is from her autobiography, The Long Loneliness. We know God in the breaking of the bread. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with the crust where there is companionship. And that's what Eucharist is. 2 generations before Vatican II, Dorothy Day came along to show everybody what it means to be really Catholic. And it's not just the old rosary beads and adoration and pray, pay, and obey. It's getting out there and feeding the hungry. That's what Jesus said to do, give drink to the thirsty, the works of mercy. And she's the one who drew attention to that. Nobody else was talking about that in the churches and then, of course, Pope John blew that all open with Vatican II. But there they are, welcome the stranger. In one of the accounts, she loved Therese. She even wrote a biography of St. Therese. And she said we wouldn't have the Catholic worker if it weren't for the little way, that doing dishes is just as important. She said when people first start working here, we make them do the dishes to show how important the humble stuff is, and just meeting and having coffee with the people of the streets, not just serving it to them and then feeling good about yourself, sitting down and talking to them. Somebody, in one of the things I read, said, in 100 years from now, when the history of the American Catholic Church is written, Dorothy Day will have a whole entire chapter, and Cardinal Spellman, her chief nemesis, will get a footnote. And I thought, that's so true. That's how it always rolls. We don't know the names of the popes, do we? Of Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila's day and, all of them. So here she is outside the St. Joseph House, which is still there in the Bowery, although the Bowery has now become one of those trendy spots. It's very beautiful. It's brownstones and flowers and foofy cafes and all that. That's Catherine of Siena hanging out the window. She loved to quote her. She quoted all the saints. She loved them dearly. One of my favorite, in one of her journal entry, she wrote, my dear friend Marie left today, and she said, I love her very much. She said, but she's one of those people that as soon as she leaves, I have to look for my Francis de Sales books and remind myself of patience. And I thought, well, we all have those people, don't we? So anyhow, for all her troubles, Cardinal Spellman calls her in downtown and says, we want you to take the word Catholic out of the Catholic worker. And she was like, well, it's kind of the point of the whole thing, it's perhaps you're not getting that memo. But it turns out his golf buddies and cigar and scotch buddies were the heads of General Electric and all the big corporations she was always out protesting against, especially during Vietnam and the nuclear arms race and all that. And they went to him and said, she's making us look bad. You got to get rid of her. And Cardinal Spellman said, I'd kick her out. He said, I wish she'd move to Hoboken and get out of my hair. He said, I'd kick her out, but everybody'd be all over me for picking on St. Dorothy Day. And she said of him, he can't stand me, but as soon as I die, he's going to make me a saint and take all the credit for it. And he never called her. She said to it actually wasn't him personally, it was his secretary, his assistant or whatever. And she said to him, well, I'll go home and discuss this with the other workers because that's how we do things there. And so that's what she did. And of course they all said, no, we're not taking the word Catholic out. And he never called her on it again. People are always wondering what she would have done if he kind of forced his hand. But she said this, no matter how corrupt the church may become, it always carries within itself the seeds of its own regeneration. Is that perfect for today or what? And she also said, as a convert, I never expected much from the bishops. In all history, popes and bishops and father abbots seem to have been blind, power-loving, and greedy. I never expected leadership from them. It's the saints who keep appearing through history, who keep things going. And I feel reading that today, she was talking about herself. She's one of those saints who's keeping us going today and to get through. And by the way, she was a very conservative Catholic. She loved her rosary. She prayed the office 4 times a day. She Blessed Sacrament. She was big on adoration. She said, I don't want to hear anything about women's ordination. She just didn't want to go there. But she broadened everybody. She saw that religion is both and, not either or, So there she is in her last great protest where she was arrested in California for being with Cesar Chavez and the migrant farm workers. I cannot help people by condemning them by my cold disapproval or by my silence. God gave us a garden to till and cultivate. The joy of creativity should be ours. And the motto that got her through life was from Dostoevsky, her favorite author, who said, in the end, beauty will save the world. And so she writes that a lot in her journals and letters if you read it. Don't forget, when you're on those down days that we all have, and you don't want to go on, beauty, go seek beauty. Just get out in nature. She'd take the subway up to Central Park and look at the flowers, whatever, just to be connected. And here's my girl, Thea, who I didn't hear of until after her death. I was visiting my dad as he was dying at home in Northeast Philly, and picked up U.S. Catholic Magazine and read her last interview. She had been dead a year by the time I even read it, and she changed my life. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for her, because she inspired. I had just asked the community if I could get out of teaching and to see if I could do art full time, and they said yeah, much to my disappointment, because I thought, ooh, if I'm a failure, now I have nobody to blame but myself, But at any event, I saw a video about her life, and that's all hell broke loose inside. I told everybody I have a black nun inside of me. It's like she possessed me, and my mission's life to let her out. So when I saw this video, 9 paintings came out. We don't have time to go through her whole story, but I've been to her home in Mississippi twice, and her mother house, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse, Wisconsin, 3 times. And all the stories I know about her now, I learned from the people who knew her. And here she is. She grew up in this house. Her dad was a doctor who graduated from medical school in 1920 from the only one school in the United States that would have black students. And he heard of this town in Mississippi. He was from Memphis. Of 10,000 people, 7,000 of whom were poor black sharecroppers. It was cotton country, and not a single white doctor who would treat black people. And so he went there with another medical doctor and a dentist, and they became the doctors, and that's where he met his wife. And on, I didn't have the dates, but Christmas week of 1937, Mrs. Bowman called her husband at his office, and she said, I think it's time, I'm going into labor. And he came home and drove her to Yazoo City, 35 miles away, to have the baby, because that was the closest hospital that would let black people in. And they lived almost within walking distance of the hospital in Canton. So that's the world Thea came up in, 1937. And in 1944, the bishop of Mississippi, the whole diocese was one state, said he wanted to open a Catholic parish in Canton, just to be a service place. He had the Trinitarian nuns there first to do social work. And then he built the church by hand, the pastor. He was a Trinitarian also. Same guys who ran with Father Judge, named for. And Thea used to run by and talk to him as he was building this church. And he asked for Franciscans to come down. His best friend was the provincial of the Franciscans up in Wisconsin. He said, I want to open a school. Would you come down? And I met one of the sisters, early sisters, in my research years ago. I was brought into their nursing home. She was blind, sitting on the edge of her bed. And I said, Sister Elizabeth, I'm here to ask you about Sister Thea. And she just lit up. And she said, oh, Thea, and the stories. And she said when she went to register to vote, the man looked up at her and said, why don't you end-loving Catholics go back north where you belong and mind your own business? It took 3 years before they could find a church, a property that would allow them to build a church, because not only was it going to be a black church, black Catholic was like double dip into hell, right? And the nuns said, this is the chief social justice issue of the mid-century in the United States, and we want to be there. And they said, we're not going to take a salary till one can be provided. And they lived like the people. They lived totally on donations. And I met one of Thea's little childhood friends who said that, she said, I was sitting on the porch. She said, I had 18 brothers and sisters, and my parents were dirt poor. We had a dirt floor in our cabin, holes in the roof, really desperate poverty. And she said, I was sitting on the front porch in 1947, and a priest in a cassock and a nun in full habit, she said, we'd never seen anything like that in our lives before, came up and said, little girl, we want you to come to our school. We're opening a school. And she said, oh, my daddy can't afford that. It was $1 a year tuition. And they said, don't worry about tuition. We'll take care of that for you. And she said they changed all the kids' lives, because she said they were there to educate us, not force us to become Catholic. And she said they broadened our horizons. And she said all of us were so poor that we didn't have food, so the nuns made breakfast for them, grits, every morning. And she said, when it was time to clean our uniforms, they would let us use they put all our uniforms in the convent washing machine. And she said they didn't have a dryer, so they just put everything in the oven so that they'd have stuff to wear. And, but that was the world, And so Thea decided to become Catholic at the age of 9, I think it was. real early. Her parents didn't object, but when she decided she wanted to be a Franciscan, then they objected. I didn't get this. They both converted to Catholicism years later, but her father especially didn't get this whole Catholic nun thing. And but more than that, he was afraid. She'd have to go up to Wisconsin, you know, and there was safety in the segregated South, you know. He was going to miss his, that was their only child. So they said no, and she went on a hunger strike till they said yes. And off she went. And the sisters told me that the day she was leaving home, he was crying his eyes out, hugging her. And he said, I beg you one last time, don't do this. He said, they're not going to like you. And she said, I'm going to make them love me. And she got in the car with the nuns that were accompanying her, and she had to get on the floor of the car, because in 1954, black girls could not be in the same car as white women. Later, when she was assigned back there again in 1960, they had to put a special wing for her bedroom on the convent because it was state law in Mississippi that blacks and whites could not live under the same roof. If you saw the movie The Help, that's what it was. But if the one guy I met there, he's now a lawyer, retired lawyer, and he came to, when I did my first presentation there, and he said, I love Thea, and he said, that's why I'm here. He said, but I grew up in the white neighborhood, and we all had black nannies and black housekeepers, and we loved them. He said, but somehow the system was so twisted, we didn't think of our nannies and housekeepers as color, you know, like the others. And he said, but she couldn't go to the bathroom in our home. We had to put a bathroom in the garage, because it was just not the way it was, you know? So what would possess, and another woman I met when I was down there, she said, and she was out shopping one day, and she said it was so hot and she was so tired, she stopped in Sacred Heart Church, which was the white church, and she said, just for a visit and to pray. And she said, a woman came up to me and tapped on me on the shoulder and said, excuse me, but we've provided a perfectly nice place in the back of church for you people to pray in. This was 1965. If a black person went to a white church for Mass on Sunday, they had to wait till all the white people got communion up at the altar rail, and then were back in their seats. Then the priest would come to the back of the church and bring them communion. They weren't allowed to go up to the altar rail. Why would anybody want to join a church like that, you know? Nothing short of the Holy Spirit at work there, you know, that she entered with such. But what she loved was the liturgy and the ritual. That's what attracted her. So she loved the elders. She always called herself an old folks child. She said, the elders made a deliberate effort to teach me about life, about love, about happiness and joy, about how to deal with insecurity, and convinced me I was special. So in 1965, I don't think I put the picture in, did I? Yeah. Of course, now nuns are allowed out of the house, and to Vatican II. And where's the first place they go? Down to march with Martin Luther King. And the Bishop of Mississippi sent word around to all pastors and said, if you do not integrate your parishes, you will be excommunicated. Now they do it if you're a Democrat down there, but back then it really meant something. And the Bishop of Alabama, when Martin Luther King announced the march that was going across the Pettus Bridge, called all the women's superiors, the head superiors, and said, if any of your nuns come down here to march, he said, you tell them to keep on walking because they're not welcome in Alabama. So talk about a divided church right there in the South. So I just love this. I gave a talk recently, and a guy came up and he said, I know that priest up front. You know, he recognized him from his parish. Anyhow, in 1968, she went to Catholic University and got her master's and then PhD in English literature. And she was the first person to teach African American literature at Catholic U. And that's now the end of Vatican II. And she loves the liturgy, and she's introducing spirituals and dance and all into the liturgy. She said, let your light shine, walk your talk. God didn't give you your light just to sit on it. You got to share it. Whatever your light is, share it. So Martin Luther King, you can see him third from the left there, spoke at the parish, preached there, shook every parishioner's hand. And then and you can see Andrew Young on the far right, the other great civil rights leader. The pastor is the tall guy in the middle there. And 3 weeks later, 1,000 civil rights freedom marchers came from all over the country to have a rally for civil rights in Canton. And when they got there, the township said, oh, you're just here to cause trouble and disrupt, and you can't do it. So Holy Child Jesus opened up it's not there, it's gymnasium. And when you read the annals, the sisters' annals that are now in the Mother House archives, it's just unbelievable. She said, The police have come with tear gas and dogs. And she said, and we're not scared because cameras from around the world are watching. History is changing right before our eyes. And even though we're exhausted, we haven't slept in 36 hours, we've opened up the convent for the ambulance drivers and the people being hurt, by the cops and all that. And she said, we are excited to be part of the change of history. And the church was right at the root of that. This is where our hope comes from. And God, a lot of people feel it's just as bad now in our country and as it was in the civil rights days, if not worse. And that's where the church needs to be. This is where Thea comes in, the prophet. Doesn't matter if you're scared, just keep on stepping. So after she got her doctorate, she studied at Oxford University for a semester as well. But she went back to Viterbo and was there for the next 9 or 10 years. She was called the most powerful woman on campus. She was never in the administration, but everybody knew Thea. She was the only black woman, number one. To this day, the only black woman that ever entered the community. But she loved drama and theater and all that, and she formed a group of singers called the Jubilee Singers. And then bring people into situations where where they can share your treasures, your art, your food, your prayer, your history, your traditions, the coping mechanisms that enabled you to survive. People are looking for sources of hope, courage, and strength. I think all of us in the church are supposed to be that kind of person for each other. So she goes back to Mississippi to be with her parents who are elderly and getting on, and she just wanted to be home again. And the bishop asked her to start the Office of Intercultural Awareness. So she got a car. She starts driving all around Mississippi, then Alabama, all over the South, giving talks on diversity at Catholic and public schools. And everywhere she went, she'd get people up to sing with her on stage. And that's what we see here. I'll be singing up there. Notice her rosary beads are breaking free, because she said if we could sing each other's songs, we could walk through each other's neighborhoods without fear. I can't preach in the church. Women can't preach in a Catholic church, but I can preach in the streets, in the neighborhood, in the home, in the family. And preaching done in the home brings life and meaning to the word preached in the pulpit. So 1984, she was 47 years old. In March of 84, she found out she had breast cancer. And the doctor said, you have 3 months to 3 years to live. And she said, I'm going to live till I die. And her mother died that November, and her father died in December of a broken heart. So 1984 was this year of constant loss. And but she was determined. She said, that's why I'm going to make the most of each day. Beautiful quote here, Lord, let me live till I die. If that prayer is answered, how long really doesn't matter. Just make the most of every day. And so she was traveling the country, became one of the biggest names in the Catholic-speaking circuit. And in 1987, she went into remission and was interviewed by Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. And they replayed it 3 times. There was such demand for it. People loved her. And they said he went down there for 2 days to interview her that had to be boiled down to this little 20-minute segment. And it's a wonderful thing. Now, I'm told it's on YouTube now. I haven't checked, but you might want to check it out. But the interview, they're sitting right at a kitchen table in the home she grew up in, and he said, Sister Thea, he said, why aren't there more Sister Theas in the world? We need more of you desperately. And she said, oh, Mike, she said, ask any one of my friends, and they'll tell you one is more than enough to deal with. And he said, what keeps you going? She said, I look in the mirror every morning, and I say, black is beautiful. And she said, I want to hear you say it, Mike. And he says, black is beautiful, and asks her another question, and she answers it politely. And then she says, I'm still waiting to hear you say it like you mean it. And the sisters told me that back in New York, the editing room was like, because he apparently was a very difficult, real prima donna. And it was the only time they remembered he insisted that the other person looked better than him. He insisted that little segment be kept in there. Anyhow, he says to her, what's your, things changed since you were a little girl here in Canton? She said, well, let's take a walk. And it shows them coming out of that house you just saw. And they walk up the street, and it's a cemetery, a guy on a tractor mowing the lawn, it's beautiful. And she said, isn't this lovely? He said, yeah. And she said, let's go around the hedge. And there's trash cans and weeds. She said, that was the white cemetery. She said, this is the black cemetery. So she said, you can see how things have changed. And she said, yeah, they have changed since I was a little girl, but we have a lot of work to do. But she said, that's where I come in as a troubadour, Franciscan, to make people smile. She does the toughest job of Christianity to make others smile. And she said, if other people ever leave our company feeling worse about themselves, then we have failed in our job as Christians. Beautiful, beautiful moment. So anyhow, her last great talk, that shortly after that, the cancer came back. It was in her bones, and she had to really cut back on her speaking schedule. And they would tell crowds, don't try to touch her or hug her because it caused her agony. But people would do it anyhow. You know, I guess they figured I'm with a saint. And when somebody said to her once, why do you let people touch you like that? It causes you such pain. And she said, in all his suffering, Jesus never said a mumbling word, so who am I? So her last great talk, literally, was 7 months before she died, was to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They asked her to speak to her, be the keynote at their assembly it was at Seton Hall, New Jersey that year, 1989. And the day her best friend, Sister Dorothy, told me it was awful. She had a setback. She was in agony, absolute pain. But she said, I promised them I'm coming. I can't skip it. And she said, Dorothy told, Dort, they call her, told me that probably air conditioning broke down. Everything was miserable. Flight delays. They finally get to the big auditorium with 400 bishops sitting there, and they hadn't arranged for handicapped accessibility. So they had to find 4 men to lift her in her wheelchair onto the stage, and they wheel her over to the microphone, and she starts singing, Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. And then she launches into this incredible sermon that she afterwards said was the best of her life. She said to Dort, that was pretty good, wasn't it? And she had the bishops in the palm of her hand. It shows them crying and laughing. And she starts at the end of her speech breaking into singing, We Shall Overcome. And they start singing with her. And she looks shocked. And you hear her say to them, you got to move together to do this, because she was teaching them how to, she said back in the day, so brothers and sisters wouldn't be separated in the marches, they would join arms like this. She said, that's what I want you to do. And the bishops of the United States doing this, swaying, singing, We Shall Overcome, crying, it was unbelievable. And at the end of her speech, they gave her a dozen roses, and she held them up in the air and said, I accept these roses in honor of all the women who nurtured you into the episcopacy. And they cheered her on. Her biggest fan was Cardinal Law of Boston. He adored her. They said he used to follow her around like a puppy dog. He started out his first years as a bishop were in the South, and he was passionate till the day he left Boston about civil rights and black-white relations and and wanting to heal all that, and that's what Christianity is. But that, of course, get lost in his legacy. But in any event, this picture, I have her walking on water. I figured it's the first miracle she got them to laugh. And but as I was told this by Tom Roberts, the reporter for the NCR, and he told me, he said, I was there that day. He said, to this day, it's the most moving thing I've ever had to write about, that whole experience. He said she had those bishops in the palm of her hand. As they were wheeling her out of the auditorium, the bishops formed an honor guard. He said it was like the parting of the Red Sea, and so that her wheelchair could come through. And as her wheelchair was coming in front of them, they were genuflecting. And I said, I never heard that. And he said, I turned to the man next to me, another journalist, and said, we're looking at the future church. And I said to him, what happened? And he said, oh, I still believe that. I said, that's what's waiting for us. I know that that's what that was. Another bishop who was there, I don't think there are any around anymore that would have been there at that time, but told me, he said, Mickey, he said, some of those guys, most of those guys, if that was their own mother on the stage, they would not have shown an emotion. He said, but she had them crying. He said it was like electricity. He said, I've never seen anything like it. And he said, every year since I pray at every bishop's meeting, please give us another Thea moment. And he said, it hasn't happened. But so anyhow, she's now servant of God, Thea Bowman, right? So my favorite story, I hope I don't, but this is a great story, I gotta share it. But she, when she left Viterbo, she had formed a group of singers, Jubilee singers, college kids, that they toured all over the upper Midwest, all Swedish and German, blonde kids, you know, there they are doing the spirituals. And she loved that, it was her favorite job. And they hired, the year she left, a new guy in the music department, who I met, and he told me, had I known I had to now be in charge of these singers, I never would have taken the job. He said, I was an uptight white guy till I met Thea Bowman. And he said, off she went back to Mississippi, and he said, I had to conduct this. He said, it's a whole different style of conducting music. He said, I would call her before concerts and in a panic, you know, help me, walk me through this. And anyhow, they became so close, she called him her brother, and he called her his sister. And so he said 3 weeks before she died, he took the choir to sing for her. they were doing concerts in New Orleans. She started the Black Catholic Studies Institute at Xavier University, by the way. It's still going on. He took the choir and he said the bus pulled up in front of the house and he panicked because the bus was bigger than the house. And he thought, how am I going to get 40 college kids in there? And she said they were standing in the living room like this and they started singing. Her bedroom was right next door. And she said, I'm not listening to this through a wall. I got to be in the room. And he said she was so frail and fragile, it took a half an hour just to move her from one room into the other and get the cushions just right and all that. And he said we sang, by the third song, she was just breaking down crying because of the emotion of it. And they sang a few more songs, and he said, we're going to stop at McDonald's for lunch on the way out of town and head back to Wisconsin. And he said, sure enough, there we were sitting at McDonald's, and he was by the window, and a car pulled up, and the rear window went down. It was Sister Thea. She had Dorothy drive her over to the McDonald's. And he signaled to the choir. He said there were no words exchanged. Kids surrounded the car and they sang Deep River, her favorite hymn, spiritual. Speaks about crossing the River Jordan, going to campground, you know. And he said she just went like this. And the window went up and she was driven off and she died 3 weeks later. And she had all her funeral plans all worked out. The church in Canton was way too small. They had it in a big church down in Jackson. And anyhow, she had him singing Deep River at her funeral, and he had this magnificent voice. So I just love that story. Up to the end, she had music as her. So here she is, her body flying home to heaven, and you can see her hair's coming back. I'll fly away. She said her grandfather taught her about slavery, and that as a little girl, and she said he always said the worst kind of slavery, it's not when you have chains around your ankles, it's when you have chains around your heart. And he said all people have those chains, no matter what color they are. And so from the time she was a girl, she wanted to grow up to be somebody to help others break the chains around their hearts. And the final picture, we shall overcome. And now it's my dream to see that hanging in front of the Vatican someday when she moves to the next step. But the sisters for years were back and forth. They're about evenly split about whether to start her cause for canonization. And they said, we're not spending that kind of money. It's great, $1 million at least to make a saint. And they said, we know she's a saint. We don't need the Vatican's approval. But last year they voted and they decided it would mean more coming from the Black Catholic community of Jackson. So it's the Diocese of Jackson that has started her cause, and that the bishops unanimously voted on it this past meeting. So this is at Boston College. They have the Thea Bowman Intercultural Student Center. I'll tell you real quick about the wheelchair I learned. They have her wheelchair in their archives. They have like a little teeny museum there. And she was being given an award at a big dinner, and also Art Rooney, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, was being given an award that same night. She was up first, and he later told people when he heard her acceptance speech, he was like, threw his out the window. He said, there's no way I can follow up on that. So he just kind of muttered out a thank you. But the next day, sent her as a gift a wheelchair. And she used that the rest of her life and called it her Steeler-mobile. I want to live fully till I die. There she is, servant of God. I think Pope Francis said, I think of the words of Martin Luther King, when you rise to the level of love, to its great beauty and power, you seek only to defeat evil systems. Frederick Douglass said this in the 1800s, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. And that's still true. And lastly, I will go, but I gotta share, this is my new thing. Black Elk. I did a mural at St. Joseph Indian School in Chamberlain, South Dakota this past January. Again, another life-changing thing. It's my new shtick now, all these murals. And this was the view out my guest apartment window when right on the Missouri River. It was frozen solid all week. And I learned so much about Lakota spirituality, but Nicholas Black Elk, 2 years ago at the Bishops' Conference, they unanimously voted to start his cause for canonization. And there's a million stories we don't have time for, but the beautiful thing about Black Elk is he never abandoned his Lakota spiritual practices. He just found a way to merge them with Catholicism, you know, and of course creatures, it's very Franciscan, all creatures, we're all the Great Spirit, we're all united as one. And the buffalo is seen as a Christ symbol. We went to Mass the first day. I was there, and the kids came in their traditional garb, and there was a buffalo skull in front of the lectern stand. And they said, because just as the buffalo gave everything to keep the Indians alive. That's what Christ gave entirely of himself. The buffalo provided food, warmth, every sinew between the muscles was used for rope and string. They didn't hunt for fun. They said the buffalo was most sacred because it was giving itself for them. Well, it's how they survived the winter. They followed the buffalo. They were nomadic. They couldn't understand whites wanting permanent homes and that yellow metal and the Black Hills, all that. So anyhow, when the the American army went in and hunters, when they slaughtered 30 million buffalo over a 20 million period as an act of genocide to kill the Lakota, the Prairie Indians. All in the president's orders from Andrew Jackson and the next 8 presidents all ordered this. The Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was just atrocious stuff. The massacres, the horrible, horrible things that American soldiers did to natives and then they brought Jesus in, that made it worse. Clobbered everybody over, hey, you have to be Christian now. So they set up boarding schools, which were atrocious, cut off the little kids' hair, forced them to wear Western clothes. It became a felony to practice Lakota spiritual practices because they just wanted to. Andrew Jackson, he said, until we wipe these people off the face of the earth, there won't be any progress. It was all done in the name of progress and putting our railroads right through their land. Anyhow, we could go on and on. I've been reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and that's where it's all chronicled. So here's the mural we did there. Mary in the center as a teepee, because teepees are the sacred homes of the people. On the left is Cataway Tekakwitha, and on the right is Black Elk. And the art teacher, found a substitute for his classes all week so he could be there to help me. And right there in the lobby of their health center, we set up, and this woman here, Claire, is the woman who invited me to be the artist in residence that week. Anybody came through, we slapped a brush in their hands. These were the little kids. They have 13 full-time counselors there. You girls, when you get out of college, if you're looking for a job, go live out there for a little while, and be a house parent. And what some of these house parents were retired couples who just want to do something different in their retirement for a year or two. It's awesome. And so there's one of the counselors with a little girl he brought down to paint. So anyhow, there's the finished product. And it's hard to see from where you are, but inside Mary's cape is the cosmos. It's all stars because the Lakota faith, religion, is cosmic. It's all about the movement of the stars and the planets and all creatures. The Great Spirit fills everything in nature. It's very Teilhard de Chardin. It's just unbelievable. It's like, and then I think this is Celtic too. This is what they taught in Ireland and before the church ruined everything. It's all about creation and connection. So anyhow, up top it says Midakue Oyashin. I wanted to put words up there like we did in Swahili, and we did that. The very last thing we did was put the words in, and it means we are connected, we are related. It's in every Lakota prayer. It's instead of amen and instead of a greeting, Midakue Oyashin. Well, that I couldn't say for the life of me, and so the art teacher went in with his phone and took video of the 7th graders. He went up to every kid and he said, tell Brother Mickey how to say, and then all these little kids, Midakue Oyashin. So that's what it is. We are related. And so I finished Friday afternoon to close. It was Catholic Schools Week. They said, would you give a talk? The whole school was assembled in their chapel, all native design chapel. It's beautiful. And I told my opening line was, when I go home, I'm going to stop calling myself Roman Catholic. From now on, I'm Lakota Catholic. So the kids didn't get it, but the adults did, and they laughed. So there's Jesus with the Sacred Heart, but around it is the Lakota medicine wheel, and all symbolic. And Cataway Tekakwitha standing on the Mohawk River, and Black Elk standing on Black Elk Peak, which until last year was named Mount Harney, the highest peak of the Black Hills. And Mount Harney was named for one of those creepy white guys that did so much damnation out there. And last year the government changed it. It's now Black Elk Peak. And that's where he had his visions as a young boy. So these are a lot of nest drawings coming out of my experience and how the beginnings and endings and cosmic. And he said everything's in a circle, that life's a circle. Nests are circles. Teepees are circles. The sun is the heart of the macrocosm. The human heart is the sun of the microcosm. And there's my Lakota Sacred Heart with linking heaven and earth, and it's all one, and the heart of Christ in the snowy hills. It was 40 below one day. At the center of the cosmos and the world, Teilhard believed, is a divine center, a living heart, beating with the fiery energy of love and compassion. Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, and then for the second time in the history of the world, humanity will have discovered fire. One of my favorite stories, Black Elk, as I said, he never abandoned his Lakota practices. The Jesuits he worked with, they say he converted over 400 people in the Pine Ridge Reservation. But the chief spiritual practice was smoking the pipe. It was like Eucharist, kind of in many ways. So anyhow, there he was, 80 years old, smoking his pipe at home. His granddaughter shared this story, and a Jesuit priest friend stopped by to visit him, also 80 years old, and walked in, and he was furious. And he ripped the pipe out of Black Elk's mouth and threw it out the window. And he said, "You've got to stop these pagan practices and adopt Christian ones." And Black Elk stood up and tore the prayer book, the office book, out of the priest's hands and threw it out the window. And she said when they each went out to pick up their items, they burst out laughing and shook hands. That was in 1950. And I think that's what's waiting for us. That's where we're as soon as this ugly time's over. So we'll end with a visitation where we began, but a quote from Teilhard. "There's something afoot in the universe, something that looks like gestation and birth." So don't cower in fear. It's all going to work out. We just got to do our bit. Try to think in this moment, with the disappointments and defeats that each one carries in the heart, that there's a God close to us who calls us by name and says, "Arise, stop crying, because I've come to set you free." Pope Francis. So amen. Thanks Kathy for inviting me tonight.
Well, I feel like we've had another resurrection experience, right? I have come to set you free. Don't you feel a lot freer? Yes. So, Nikki, thank you. Yeah, a good way to just be buoyed up with the hope that we need to move forward. Yeah, so we have nothing to fear, right? It's all possible. Thank you, Nikki. We believe.